we are exploring various parts of Italy, and if you've caught much of the playlist so far, you'd know we've done an appreciable amount of Sicily, a decent amount of Lombardy, Venetia and Friuli, and a pretty large amount in the city of Rome. You don't need to reinforce the various parts of the country we're still missing, we are only too aware. However, in the autumn, after we visited Rome, we had another trip, and I didn't think that this would be an episode, at least not in this series. First of all, it was largely places in and around Venice, a second time doing so if you're keeping count, but we also had a very particular target as a high priority. You know, it's a tiny thing really, but just back to my hometown a second, not my current hometown, but where I grew up for 20 years. This is Chichester. Now, town twinning is famous for being spectacularly inconsequential. Like maybe your primary school sets up a pen pal scheme. It's really not all that. But while I've never been to Chartres, I was vaguely aware, that Chichester was twinned with somewhere called Ravenna. There's a street named after it. And that's basically it. But I can't lie, it sparks a bit of a curiosity. And when you actually find out what Ravenna is, or was, we're not there just yet, so we'll unpack properly in a moment. Well, this story has a slow start, getting soaked just getting to the early coach in Bournemouth so much that it totally nixed my phone screen. Yeah, a sudden downpour on my way to the 1am coach nearly took out my phone with all of my boarding passes, onward bus tickets and means of communication. I'm actually going to cut out most of this first day because there's not a lot to show. It kind of mainly rained a lot and I want us to get to the good stuff. So I was up and around 5am, an early croissant and espresso at Venice Mestre station, and we were off at the earliest opportunity. The train was around 3 hours, if I recall. We're heading through the Po Valley, which is one of the flattest places in Italy, and it was rolling farmers' fields for miles and miles. A quick change at Ferrara, and eventually we're pulling into Ravenna. Now, I don't know how many people who've clicked on this know what Ravenna is. I mean, sure, the sizzle reel at the top of the episode, or, the thumbnail, might have given you a clue, but okay, we'll use the first stop as a way to explain. Though, if I may say, stepping out the train station, I mean, this seems like a fairly unremarkable place to begin with. We're already in the flattest bit of Italy, so there's no mountain landscapes or gorgeous coastlines. It's just a small Italian town. But down a couple of streets and we're at this church with a fairly interesting tower, although all of this is pretty unadorned. I was there just in time for opening, and inside we've got this whole load of gold mosaics, and they're from 1,500 years ago, and this needs some explaining. It's the classic gotcha question when asking, what was the capital of the Roman Empire? And everyone answers, Rome. You can be all smug and talk about the Tetrarchy and the four capitals of Trier, Sirmia, Mediolanum and Nicomedia, and generally make your friends at the pub agree not to invite you to the next meetup. So by the 400s, not only were things in the western half of the empire just not going so great, but Rome was not seen as the shining centre of all things as it may have done in the days of Caesar. And in 401, Honorius transferred the capital from Mediolanum, that's Milan to you and I, to Ravenna. Now that is a puzzling move based on modern geography. Milan today is essentially the capital of northern Italy and an absurdly wealthy and successful hub. And Ravenna is a town of only about 150,000 people that doesn't otherwise leap out. However, the key in this case was that Ravenna was surrounded by marsh. While the land in modern times has been reclaimed and used for farming, being surrounded by marshy land made it far more defensible. Interestingly, this makes it something of a forerunner of what the earliest settlements that would later coalesce into Venice would end up doing. Putting water and marshland between you and otherwise land-based threats would prove a pretty good strategy in late antiquity. But even in the twilight of the Western Roman Empire, as things began to crumble, the new status of Ravenna would make it the focus of building projects, art and monuments that, taken together, are unmatched by their quality and state in which they have survived. We'll have a lot more to say, but first we have to enjoy the Saint Apollinaire Nuovo. The upper levels are these long friezes of gold mosaic, processions of figures, and other remarkable details gleam down from the walls. There's practically a whole episode just talking about this one church. So having to move along feels awful, but before we do, there's just one more detail. At the back of the church, in a corner, a not especially well lit corner either, is this mosaic. And you can see the inscription here for Justinian. You know, people might be familiar with this extraordinarily famous mosaic of Justinian. It's a little tempting to note that, he let himself go a bit. However, there is a modest consensus that rather than a depiction of Justinian, the inscription had later been altered and was a modification of a portrait of another hugely significant figure of the era, Theodoric. Okay, so to carry on the story, let's head out the church, and we don't need to go at all far, in fact just a few strides down the road. This is the Palace of Theodoric, except that's going to need a few asterisks. The histories tell us that the Roman emperors had a palace next to what is now the Basilica of St. Apollinare Nuovo, and in the church there is a depiction of what we think was this palace. This portion specifically may have been more of a guardhouse, essentially an annex to the palace, but still, when you have structures that are 1,500 years old and they've survived this well, I am certainly not in a complaining mood. So that's another name drop for Theodoric. I'm afraid that my audience for this is going to be split between people who are already entirely aware of all the major beats of the history of Ravenna and people who have no idea. For those of you for whom this is not news, thank you for your patience. You know, a number that endures in school textbooks and short, simple explainers. The year 476, this date has been hyped to be so significant, though, nowadays people are less inclined to see this as quite the huge deal that we used to. In 476, the Emperor Romulus Augustulus, who was only about 10 or 11 years old, was deposed by a leader of a unit of foederati, or essentially some mercenaries led by Odoacer or Odoacer, who defeated the Roman army in the field and took Ravenna. And this is traditionally marked as the end of the Roman Empire in the West. Notably, the empire in the east, based in Constantinople, was still very much alive and well. However, one of the reasons that this is not the completely clean split that people think is that the subsequent leaders, who were styled kings of Italy, were not some slathering horde who poured into Italy, getting their saliva all over the marble. Quite the opposite. Not only had Odoacer risen through the ranks of a force employed by the Roman army, but they are using the apparatus of state in Italy to rule and very much following a Roman mould. Now, Odoacer would rule for about 17 years, but he himself was supplanted and murdered by the Gothic leader Theodoric. And Theodoric would go on to rule for 33 years and was a pretty remarkable ruler, even for a time becoming ruler of the Visigoths in the Iberian Peninsula, extending his territory from the Balkans to the Atlantic. And nowhere is his success more apparent than the mark he left on Ravenna. Many of the things we're going to be looking at date partially or entirely from this era of Ostrogothic Ravenna. Okay, well, I was trying to keep moving as I had a lot to cover in the day, so I had to be keeping up a modest pace. It was interesting to be seeing the town of Ravenna, which was nice, pretty quiet. It's not lost on the town that a lot of visitors are going to be wanting to follow this trail of sites from 1,500 years ago, so there is a combined ticket which includes entry to most of the key ones. A couple of these are timed, thanks to their popularity and smaller size. The next was this cluster by the cathedral, which, while pretty nice to look at, the main body of the cathedral is not the most significant part here, but in fact, next door, and this was one of the timed visits, this is the Baptistry of Neon. While the building is from around the early 400s, it's what's inside, and if you look up to the ceiling, these mosaics were added at the end of the 400s. It was pretty busy in there, so while, thankfully, it's not too hard to photograph the ceiling with other people framed out, other details like the baptistry itself were a little more hit and miss. We then headed into the museum, which abuts the cathedral and contains an incredible selection of stonework, particularly from around the Ostrogothic era. As we said, these are not a bunch of barbarians going bar, 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 and smashing things with a wooden club like Captain Caveman. These are people looking to rule and practice Christianity and create art very much in the same manner the Romans had already been doing. And this is a pretty incredible exhibition too. There's a great many highlights, including this calendar for the years 532 to 626, the ivory carvings on this chair, but stealing the show, the mosaics of the Chapel of St. Andrew. You can see just how remarkable this collection in Ravenna is. Such a wealth of golden mosaics from a millennia and a half ago. And we'd been lucky to catch some pieces a bit similar to this. For example, on the opposite side of the Adriatic, the Euphrasian Basilica in Porec is of a similar era and contains these mosaics in the nave. A few examples from Cyprus, and there's these damaged examples from the Rotunda in Thessaloniki. And not to take too long over this, but there is a reason that Ravenna stands out as such a unique trove of Byzantine mosaics. Yep, stamp your bingo cards for all the classicists playing at home. It's the iconoclasm controversy. This was something that nearly tore the Eastern Empire apart several times, and in the process greatly deepened rifts with the West. With that, time for a quick espresso. Very much appreciated the mosaics under the Church of St. Euphemia from a bit earlier than the examples we've been seeing so far, but won't go into detail here. Heading a little further on, a chance to see two contrasting walls of the city. The first, this incredibly substantial artillery defence and gate, but just down the road, a much older fragment of wall survives. With some later additions, this is part of the work undertaken under Honorius when he moved the capital here. Well, it was just after midday and time to see two of Ravenna's greatest highlights. Firstly, this small structure is a curious story. It was originally built as a chapel. It was later to be the mausoleum of Galla Placidia, and she herself has quite the backstory, but she did not end up getting buried here, so we just have some of the finest mosaics of late antiquity sitting here just cause. The structure has sagged in places such that the shape of the roof is not entirely symmetrical. Still, it's in exceptional shape for its age. And then, not hard to see this as the centerpiece of Ravenna. In spite of all we've already shown you, this is the Basilica of San Vitale. Now, the outside would be impressive enough for a millennia and a half old church, but gosh, it wouldn't just happen to have some gold mosaics inside, would it? Nah, come on. What makes you say yes? Obviously. And here, either side of the apse, images that are easily of equal importance to something like the Bayeux Tapestry. These are the mosaics displaying Justinian on one side and Theodora on the other, and quite the cast of characters with them. Yet we've already done a fair amount of quick explainers in this episode. I really can't give you the whole account of the 400s and 500s and all the back and forth. Justinian really is the guy when it comes to earlier Byzantine history. His achievements and how close he came to pulling the empire back to, well, pretty close to how it was before all the sackings and upheavals in the 400s. And for us, Ravenna is just another step on a huge journey that we've been on, whether it's the churches in Petra, in what's now Jordan, to the shores of Lake Ohrid in North Macedonia, to the Venetian lagoon in the north of Italy, to the mountains all the way at Italy's southern tip, to Greece and its many islands, to Bulgaria and Western Anatolia, and all the way back to Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, the shining centre of it all. Our journey to trace what was the Byzantine Empire, and don't even start with all the comments. You are all so boring and predictable, like everyone knows the score. Byzantine is a useful distinction, and we're gonna keep using it. Ugh. So that journey is very much still ongoing, but this was a major milestone. The immense satisfaction in seeing the glories of Ravenna, these miracle survivals, this was huge for us. Well, we're not done. Though I had powered through the day so far, I'd not really taken a bite to eat apart from this croissant and could feel myself getting a bit scratchy. So that was the next thing. A little bit more of a speed run from here, low angle flag shot. Did go into the museum. Funny thing, and while there was some great stuff in there, I appeared to not be the only one who was struggling to find the exit. It's a set of interconnected buildings with a bewildering array of corridors, and yet it was far from clear what the official route to extricate yourself from the building was supposed to be. While I'd passed this in the morning, it was time to head into the Basilica of St. Francis. You can see these mosaics that are now underwater, and there are fish. Okay. Next one. This is another of the hugely significant survivors. It's the Arian baptistry, and I am not explaining the Arian controversy here. We are already smuggling in a Byzantine 101 in this episode. I don't have 10 minutes to unpick disputes on the nature of Christ and ecumenical councils. There's just only so many hours in the day, and this is not the time. Just enjoy the mosaics. Opposite this, it's the Basilica dello Spirito Santo, built at the same time as the baptistry in the time of Theodoric. there was a pretty great espresso spot just round the corner. Heading back in the direction of the train station, a stop we just passed earlier, this is the Church of San Giovanni Evangelista. A lot of these are later medieval mosaic, later than you usually think of folks making mosaics, but there's all sorts, including a proto-Starbucks logo, so that's fun. Anyway, we are heading a short way out of the centre to the north of the town. There's this castle, the Rocca Brancellione, generally referred to as the Venetian castle. You know, this is a little way south of the area that Venice would control in mainland Italy. They were in control of Ravenna for a spell in the 14 and early 1500s. All of this is a story for a later episode, so pardon me if we skim this for now, because we're on our way to perhaps one of the most famous sites in Ravenna. It's certainly an instantly recognisable outline. It's the Mausoleum of Theodoric, built around 520 of Istrian stone. Theodoric's remains were later removed, though you can see inside this made of porphyry? I'm never sure how to pronounce that. Quite simply, it is entirely architecturally distinct from anything else that is going on either in the former Roman West or Byzantine East. It's really something. Well, time was getting on in the afternoon, and I had ticked off pretty much everything I'd set out to do. I'd had to keep pretty busy doing it, but overall was feeling pretty great about things. However, it's always the case, no matter how much time you put in before a trip to track down historical stuff, nothing beats just being there. There's always some detail down a side street or all manner of things that you just simply can't scout out in advance. And in this instance, in amongst all the gold mosaics and basilicas with Italian titles, there's one I'd missed. And look, in fairness, it is both out of town and double camouflaged, because this, where we started the day, is the Basilica of St. Apollinaire Nuovo. You can probably get that the Nuovo there means new, but there is also a Basilica of St. Apollinaire not Nuovo, which is out of town in a small village called Class A, whatever. It was later in the afternoon, but perhaps because a lot of people end up in a similar position to me, there was both some buses that could get me there and back, and I could just about do it if I got a move on, so worth a shot, I suppose. After a short spell to figure out how the bus system worked, purchased a couple of bus tickets from the train station, and just in time to hop on and get out of town to, well, here it is, St. Apollinaire in Class, and just in time for the sun to douse the top of it in golden light. Inside, this is up there with some of the most impressive mosaics in Ravenna. The huge apse has this glorious scene above it. In the centre, Apollinarius, who we think lived between the sort of 1 to 200s in the area of Ravenna, though sources are spotty. There are many more details besides. In the corner of the church, I just briefly caught this Lombard canopy. This is from a later phase, which kind of leads us to the coda of the Ravenna story. The Ostrogothic rule of Italy and much of the Balkans was comparatively short-lived. Despite all of Theodoric's successes, just a couple of generations from 476, the Byzantines would be back to try and restore something of the empire in the west, and the ensuing fight, which went for several rounds, would end up wrecking Italy, just leaving the place in an absolute state. And so when later an extremely petty squabble amongst the Byzantine nobles in the area opened the door for the Lombards to head into the peninsula, they glomped huge tracts of the Italian boot without much trouble and would be in place for centuries to come. Now, in modern times, pursuing Lombard traces across Italy is not easy, but say it with me now, it's a story for another time. All that remained was to head outside and catch an astonishingly beautiful sunset over the fields, which, on a day that had been mostly overcast, was a particular treat. So all of this felt just amazing. Having done a pretty good job of making it around all the ancient treasures of Ravenna in just a single day, I was feeling pretty good about that. Even got this extra bracelet for the wrist to mark the occasion. I get these when I can, but particularly for journeys that are special in some way. For example, ones where you have to go a bit further out of the way. So, for example, going to Troy, which was a major milestone. I was staying in pretty boring accommodation, which was fine, but doesn't really merit remarking upon. Did head out into Ravenna at night to get a drink, but my filming produced less than spectacular coverage. And early next morning, it was back on the train and out of town. Now, that was a lot. So you're probably expecting the end of the episode calls to action around here, but this was actually just day 2 of the whole trip. Now, if you check the runtime, we're not devoting anywhere near the same amount of time to the other places we saw, but I didn't want to just leave all of this on the cutting room floor. So it was actually a bit of a fiddly train journey, 3 trains in fact, including, to finish, this tiny one, but it eventually got us over to Chioggia. Chioggia, apologies for the crude shorthand, but this is like a mini Venice. Look, there, I said it. People are quick to label all sorts of towns as a miniature Venice, even if they've just got a couple of channels down the middle. But you're allowed to say it when it's in the Venetian lagoon and has various canals that were built by the Venetians. Just an aside here, kind of a funny story. The hostel of this evening, I was talking to people about what I'd been doing during the day, and when I talked to them, I was like, yeah, so then I went to, Chioggia. And there was a guy who spoke Italian at the table. He was like, wait, where? What? I was like, yeah, Chioggia. It's not very far from here. He was like, do you mean Chioggia? He wasn't angry. He just more looked like confused and hurt. And I was like, presumably, yes. I still really am not sure. You can probably tell from my pronunciation of some of the church names. I'm still really not sure about hard consonants in Italian. Like, it's this whole grey area. Anyway, I'd done this 3-hour multi-train journey there, which was a little tedious, but Chioggia was a big priority for this trip, and it was great to see. However, it soon became apparent I'd semi-marooned myself in this corner of the lagoon. Sundays just turn out to be a real desert for decent transport options. In the end, more in a panic, I flagged a bus that just appeared to be heading, well, at least back towards another point on the map where I could link up with the trains again. Now, this was not an attempt at being naughty. I am terrible at rule breaking, ask anyone I travel with. So, a phenomena I encountered in the Friuli episode, quite a lot of bus routes in northern Italy, the drivers just won't take any sort of payment, card, cash, nothing. So, I ended up unintentionally jumping the bus, unable to get the app to work to let me pay for my ride. Bear in mind, it doesn't have an English translation option. So, rather tense, lest I be chastised for this €2 indiscretion, I hopped off a couple of stops early in Padua. Now, I'd been to Padua before. I, to be honest, hadn't been massively sold on it. I ate Angus and Padua stands. The grey hadn't helped, and far from being the medieval town name-dropped by Shakespeare, it just all seemed quite modern and not that remarkable. Okay, well, in the sunlight, it has some decent highlights. The cathedral was looking great, and while this hadn't actually been a target for this day, I was glad to get a bit more coverage, including this Roman theatre, which appears to never be open. But okay. Anyway, Padua afforded me a link back to the regular rail network. Now, it's impossible for me to display this on camera, and as a narrator, I try and keep myself mostly out of frame in favour of letting the locations be the main character. For this trip, I just felt ill and exhausted almost the entire time. It was one of those elusive things, without a headache or a runny nose or any notable outward symptoms apart from a persistent cough that, as it turned out, didn't shift for a couple of months after this. It's just not all that surprising to feel tired based on the hours I keep for trips like this, but it took a while to realise that my near constant exhaustion, at least by early afternoons, was not business as usual. So this made an otherwise very enjoyable trip something of a difficult time. I was attempting to medicate myself with a pairing of espresso and beer just to try and summon the enthusiasm to keep going to the next place, but you don't have to be my GP to tell me that's a highly suboptimal plan to keep yourself on the move. So this is where I found myself, slumped in a coffee bar in Vicenza, trying to get my enthusiasm back. Vicenza was beautiful and definitely grateful for everything I'd been able to catch so far, but just struggling and also feeling somewhat alone. There was a strange log jam taking place on the train line. I'm not entirely sure what. Eventually, a tide of people all swarmed onto a train, and thankfully, at length, it got us back to Venice Mestre. Different hostel for these nights. I was fortunate I found some good humans to talk to. There was a Dutch group recounting some of their clubbing misadventures from the past 48 hours. Venice Mestre doesn't sound like a very good place for a night out, all things considered. I sort of want to speedrun the rest. I'm not going to be able to go to enough depth, at least not here. After the crack of dawn's start, there were some good times in Venice, although I'd forgotten just how much the constant walking exhausts you. I even made it all the way over on the boat to Torcello, which is another major target, and more gold mosaics, nom 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 nom. From there, I looped out of Venice and to Treviso, which was much more of a relaxing time, tracing the Venetian walls around there, daubed in autumn colours with an emerald river flowing below. It was bliss, though, the exhaustion persisted. And it was masked by okay, am I tired because I'm getting over being ill, or because I've walked 4 to 5 hours already today? More espresso and beer just to try and keep on track. Next day, Venice was pretty rainy. Fair enough, it was the end of October. And when I eventually made it out of town on the train, I had a quick explore of Brescia while trying, without much success, to keep dry. Eventually, to tee me up for my return flight, arrived after dark in Milan, headed to what turned out to be a pretty average hostel, but with some above average people to talk to into the early hours. Had some things to see in Milan, but the scale is so out of sync with ever I'd been so far. It was a good hour just to walk into the centre, and the Duomo and other things I'd caught before were wreathed in grey. More espresso, more walking, a lot more walking. I did begin to get some of the late Roman parts of the city. I've still got more to do yet, but while they're fragmentary, you can start to get the pieces together of ancient Mediolanum. And since this trip had been such a bumper time for gold mosaics, I have to mention these in the apse of San Lorenzo Maggiore. They've been a bit damaged and can't hope to stand up to the vast panels of Ravenna, but on both age and beauty they have to be remarked upon. Then, after a very long return walk, train to Malpensa and back to the UK. And funny enough, I linked back up with Jen and we pretty much headed straight for Shropshire to do what's become a tradition of visiting there in autumn with castles and hill forts, but it soon became apparent as I attempted my usual pace of hill forting, no, this is just not happening. I really am getting over some sort of illness. I ended up having to have a major crash and needed several days before I started to be myself again. So this is a bit of a strange, abridged manner to skim over what was a pretty substantial journey with a lot happening. But I'm glad to have been able to share all the Ravenna stuff, and basically everything else from above will be on display and much better unpacked when we wrap up the Venetian Republic series. That is, it's not coming just yet, but there's already 13 episodes of that up, so definitely check that playlist. Meanwhile, we've already been mentioning the Italy playlist. You can catch the next bit over from where I was around Verona and Lake Garda, or in the other direction to the east, Friuli. It's an area you rarely hear talked about in Italy, but it's well worth a look. Plus, there's Rome and a lot on Sicily. This all makes a pretty good start, and we've got more in the works. At time of writing, we're just back from Naples and a journey all the way down the southwestern end to Calabria. So that's not coming straight away, but it's going to be going there eventually. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed the music in the background, it's ours. We make all the music for these episodes, and you can find it on bandcamp.com. If you want to support us at the channel, that's the place to do it. Otherwise, please follow us on the socials, particularly on our Bluesky. We tend to go into more historical details that we maybe haven't had time for in this episode, so find us there. Otherwise, we'll catch you very soon.